Whatever happens tomorrow, you must promise me one thing. That you will stay who you are. Not a perfect soldier, but a good man.
Hello,
Hi, I'm Serena,
I'm Kayla.
and we're students taking Education 18, a course on disability justice and education. And today we're going to be talking about disability in superhero films.
So, we're going to be taking a close look at two Marvel superheroes, Captain America, aka Steve Rogers, and the Scarlet Witch, otherwise known as Wanda Maximoff.
This is the first episode in our three-part series, Cripping Captain America. And we'll take a close look at Steve Rogers specifically and talk about what disability has to do with his story.
So, before we get into Captain America, we kind of wanted to talk about general negative stereotypes there are of disability in media and how they're actually represented in like superhero narratives. So, we're going to talk about first this idea of supercrip. So, in one of my education classes, we had to read a book called Disability Studies and Inclusive Classrooms by Baglieri, if I'm not mistaken. And basically, they define it as a disabled person is portrayed as deviant because of superhuman feats or as special because they have regular lives in spite of their disability. So, we're going to be kind of focusing more on the first part of that and how it pertains to superhero films and narratives in general, because it's focusing on someone who basically overcomes their disabilities in ways that are seen as like inspiring, and their powers kind of forego their disabilities in a way or overcome them.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that Supercrip is usually not about superheroes. Like, it's about regular people who, manage to go to college and then get a PhD despite their disability. And that's what makes them so extraordinary. That's what makes these like inspiring stories. I'm sure you can all think of movies that are focused on those kinds of stories. But there are disabled heroes. So we're really interested in this idea of how do these actually like canonically disabled heroes demonstrate or embody the supercrip narrative. And one very prominent example is Daredevil, who's able to overcome his disability blindness because of his heightened senses.
Right. So we're gonna show this clip where basically Matt Murdock, who's Daredevil, his friend finds out that he's like this masked vigilante kind of protecting Hell's Kitchen, and he's like, so are you not actually blind? And he kind of explains some of his other abilities that basically is like, yes, I can't really see, but because of all of these things, I don't really need to see in a way. Or like what I do is like it's bigger than sight essentially. Um, so we're gonna play this clip, and yeah.
It's hard to explain, Foggy. My abilities, I just know things. Okay?
No, not okay. Can you read my mind? Can you predict the future? What? What things do you just know?
I know you haven't showered since yesterday morning. But you rinsed your face in my kitchen sink. I know you had onions in your lunch 2 days ago. I know you're hungry and tired. And I know the more I say, the faster your heart beats.
You can hear a heartbeat? From across the room?
Helps to anticipate behavior. When someone's gonna attack. When they're lying.
Yep. So essentially, aside from all the roasting of Foggy, he's like he has these heightened senses in terms of smell, taste, touch, and hearing. And he even like uses like echolocation to basically see, quote unquote, like where his opponents are. And
That's super cool.
it's really cool until you're like, maybe this isn't actually a good portrayal of like disability, or I mean, it's superheroes and it's fake, so obviously it's not going to be like realistic, but you're definitely going to have like some audience perceptions of being like, oh, okay, now every blind person I see, like, can they like hear better all of the sudden, or like are their senses just heightened in general? Like, I don't know. It's not the best representation out there, but
Yeah, and there's just so much like fear and suspicion in his friend's voice,
Right,
even
right.
though they've like known each other for a while. Like this idea that disability or somehow just having like non-normal abilities makes you really like inscrutable. Like you can't really like he's telling you what he can do, but Froggy's like, oh my god, I have no idea what you can do. That's so invasive and terrifying to be around you.
yes. Okay. So that's kind of that idea of Super Crip. But another common disability trope we see is this idea of someone with or a superhero with disability being inherently weaker. So despite their like immense power, they're naturally just seen as kind of like weaker, or they have like if you were to do one of those like strength and weaknesses of
Yeah,
like super, that would
that's
be
their
like
main
their
weakness.
top. That would be their top up
Just
there.
debuffs them.
Right. And then they're kind of seen through more of like a pity charity lens in terms of in universe, so that's how like other people would react to them. But then I feel like in real life when we see these like superheroes, it's kind of like I don't know if I would put them on my like team necessarily because they have this. And I think a common person or like a common character we see this with is Professor X, who is one of the strongest X-Men. I mean, he like founded like the school to train all these like extraordinary beings and or mutants, but he's like rarely taken seriously because of the fact that he's in a wheelchair. So I watched this series called Great Taste on All Def Digital, and they basically have a debate on what's the best of something of a category. So this episode was what's the best X-Men. And so one of them was arguing for Professor X, and he had a lot of like good points, being like, once again, he can do so many things. But the common kind of like rebuttal to that was that he can't walk. So here's a clip from that.
Not only can he make himself invisible, he can make you think that something else is
I don't
happening.
care until he can make himself walk. He has this is
Y'all
a
got
moot
nothing.
point.
Let me tell you something.
We got
Rob.
y'all got nothing.
Professor X can do a great many things, but he won't do it.
Right.
So much to unpack there.
So much.
But yeah, just like you said, the way, but he's in a wheelchair, but he can't walk is like the takedown, like the ult. It's the ultimatum. Like whatever he does, whatever argument you have, ultimately he's in a wheelchair and he can't walk, and therefore that somehow makes him weaker.
Right, and it's like if he really is as powerful as everyone says, or if that you're arguing, then shouldn't he be able to make himself walk? And it's just like like that's not how it works. But also it shouldn't be seen as like taking away from his power.
It's also just weird that like they're talking about the X-Men. Like these are people with
Right.
weird abilities, with weird appearances. Like they're known as the mutants of the Marvel universe. So it's interesting to me that like him being in a wheelchair
It's like the most bizarre thing.
yeah.
Yeah. And it's even like interesting too with looking at Professor X is like how kind of like disability is seen as a punishment of sorts, or like a you kind of stepped out of line, so now you're paralyzed. And it's just like is that, and I think I forget her name. There's another superhero like that. She's also, I think, a wheelchair user, and it didn't start out like that. Like she was like crime fighting or something, and like I think I'm sorry, this feels like very vague, but
No, a good example though is Rhodey in Captain America Civil
yes,
War. Like they kind of
yes.
like, look what you've done. Like these friends fought each other, and now the
Right,
serious consequences are
right.
Rhodey being disabled.
yes. Oh my gosh, that is a good point.
Yeah, like the way it's like how the film ends too, like seeing Rhodey struggling to relearn how to walk is supposed to be like the emotional hit. Like, oh, these are
Right.
consequences of your actions,
Of your
Tony.
actions, exactly. So it's like, why is disability seen as a punishment of sorts?
Thing that comes up from the Great Taste video that I find really interesting is this idea that, well, if he's so powerful, why can't he just walk then? Why can't he just cure himself? Which is also a really common trope. It's particularly in sci-fi movies. like I'm sure you heard like Star Trek, these conversations around, well, if you're creating a dystopia
Right.
where there's such advanced technology, or if these people are superpowered human beings, why can't they just cure themselves? Which is a really, I mean, that's the medical model of disability, that somehow we can improve technology so much that we can kind of make up for or normalize people's disabilities, and that is something that is good and that should be celebrated as advancement.
Which is like really problematic, and I think as you get further into kind of like this, or like searching closer or getting closer to, I guess, this idea of like utopia and like all this is like, well, utopia shouldn't include disability, essentially.
Right, yeah.
Which is like not a great way to think about it. And I think it's also, like you said, it kind of reflects this like medical model of disability where it's like it should just be cured, something that needs to be fixed. It's like an inherent flaw. And if we're getting to this utopia, if we're getting to this perfect idyllic place, then why would we have those flaws? Why would we have like these disabilities or impairments?
Yeah, it assumes that people wouldn't want to be in a wheelchair, wouldn't want to be sick, wouldn't want to be blind, and everyone should just be the same.
Right.
In some utopia. Yeah.
So yeah, that does like bring definitely up a interesting conversation. And we'll also say like, obviously the jokes they make are offensive. Like, you know, we're not going to shy away
They're
from
also
that.
very common.
Yeah. They're like, it does like reflect how people think of characters like Professor X. So you just want to say like, don't like show them too much hate, I guess, but we do understand that like it is wrong. Like, but like that's why we want to like bring it up in this like
right. And I think even the people in that clip wouldn't really think that they're being ableist, because I'm sure they're like, oh, it doesn't make him any less of a human being, and they might pity him for being in a wheelchair, and they wouldn't treat him any differently. But just the way they're assuming that he wouldn't want to be in a wheelchair, and the kinds of like implications in what they're saying are quite ableist.
Yeah, exactly. So now we kind of like, with those common tropes kind of like listed and talked about a little bit, we want to get into why we chose to talk about Steve Rogers of all the kind of canonically disabled superheroes that we could have chose from.
Yeah, like Steve Rogers is not really in the popular culture seen as a disabled superhero, which we'll get into in a bit. But one of the main reasons we wanted to focus on Steve and Marvel movies in general are just that these films are such massive blockbusters that have such a chokehold on like our popular culture, on the way we understand the world and each other. And they're also really mainstream in a way that is kind of like apolitical, as if any sorts of moral messaging or political messaging that are in these films are just like benign. Like it's just like violence, killing people, bad, heroes, good, this is a good thing. Things like that, or like Captain America's big things like bullying, bad.
No,
literally. So like we kind of think that they don't have malicious or like maybe problematic like significance. So we think it's important to actually investigate what kinds of ideas about disability and ability are being implicitly promoted in these very expensive films.
Right. And also it's just Steve Rogers is such like a big character. So known.
Yeah.
By like, okay, I guess I'm not going to say by everyone, because there obviously can be people who don't know like Steve Rogers and Captain America. But this character has been popular since like the 40s.
And he's an American icon. Like,
literally. Yeah,
unlike other superheroes, he's continuously equated with the nation, with patriotism.
Like he fought Hitler.
Like that's like that's the ultimate for
that shot him into fame. So it's just like one of these things where, because we often think about if you're like kind of like a bigger Marvel fan, you think of Steve in kind of two like phases: pre-serum, post-serum. But just for like the general kind of public, you see him as post-serum Steve, right? And he has this perfect body. He is super handsome, whatever. He encapsulates everything that America is, essentially.
Mhm.
And so a lot of times people don't associate him with disability, but we were reading this article by Dittmer, and it's called Captain America's Empire: Reflections on Identity, Popular Culture, and Post 9/11 Geopolitics. So we found that in this article, the author goes through like a few Captain America comics and argues that he's intended by its creators to represent the best aspects of America, both in terms of like values like courage and honesty, but also in terms of ability and physicality that's often not really noticed by the general public. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit. But his body and his like disabilities are inseparable from his like ideological purpose, which is
Mhm.
basically to fight for the country.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's also the other thing I'll say he's associated with is just like the miracle
Right.
of technology or
Mhm.
of science. Like the miraculousness of his transformation is supposed to, I think the significance of like World War II, like it's supposed to be like, oh, America has all this really impressive military technology as
right.
well that can keep up with Nazi Germany. And it's also like it's only so miraculous. Like the transformation is only so amazing because of how disabled
Mhm.
and weak they make him seem prior to the serum.
Right. And I just want to get into some of these because when we were doing like research for this, it was kind of crazy how like riddled with disabilities and illness Steve Rogers was in like pre-serum. And I'll just like list through some of this. Is not even all of what I'm about to list right now. So he has like severe asthma, he had scarlet fever, sinusitis, I think that's how you pronounce it. Sorry. Chronic or frequent colds, high blood pressure, palpitations, pounding heart, easy fatigability, heart troubles, nervous troubles. And then in like the comics, it goes on. He has scoliosis, color blindness, anemia, partial deafness, diabetes. And it's just like the list keeps going. And you're just like, well, it kind of brings up two different conversations. I think on one hand, it brings up the fact that with each kind of iteration of Steve Rogers, his list of disabilities gets smaller and smaller because you want to think about what's palatable for audiences. But then on the other hand, you're like, why does he have this grocery list of disabilities? And not that it's like impossible, but you kind of think about what was their goal in doing that.
Yeah, and again, the context of the 40s, the 50s, this was the age of eugenics in America. So all of these disabilities, and also it's mentioned that his mother worked as a nurse in a TB ward. So he was at a higher risk for
that's how she died, I think.
Yeah, and that is how she died. So he's also seen as more likely to get TB. And so all of these kinds of like chronic illnesses, disabilities, makes him what would have been considered an invalid at the time and a dependent. So he was socially and politically undesirable. Like he stood for all of these people who, you know, are like not working and just like stealing your taxes or whatever. So I think this context is really important to kind of shed light on why Steve wants to join the army so badly. And why he keeps saying he needs to prove himself through this act. And also how the serum is like this eugenics miracle, actually. Like it's the dream of the eugenicist. You can just cure all of these disabilities and get a perfect body.
Right. And it's very it's very interesting because he's seen as someone, and this is tied into his whole like enlistment process of the fact, I think he like does it at least 5 times. I think tries to enlist at least 5 times canonically, and he gets rejected each time because it's like, hey, I think literally one of the clips from Captain America First Avenger, the First Avenger is like, the guy was like, I'm saving your life by not putting you in this war because you are too weak to actually fight in it. and that's paraphrasing, but that's essentially like the idea. And he tries so hard to be a part of it, but it's his passion to fight
Yeah.
for the country and to
Oof.
defend everything that like
Yeah,
it
yeah.
stands for.
Mhm. And the implication there is also in
Yeah.
those rejections that it's because of his disabilities that he's seen as unfit to be American, because he
Right.
can demonstrate his patriotism, his Americanness,
Even though he's like the most
through
patriotic.
fighting. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting for that. And then it's like, oh, because he's so passionate about fighting for the country, because he's so patriotic and he's this good person, like through and through, he is deserving enough to be cured of his disabilities. He's deserving enough to become the perfect specimen, so to speak, and to overcome all his physical disabilities. And that's part of the reason why we thought having that kind of long list of disabilities and illnesses was really interesting, because it's used as a contrast for everything that he becomes post serum. So the weaker that he seems, the more kind of, I don't know, and I don't know how to explain it, but like the weaker he seems, kind of
the more dramatic.
the more
the
dramatic it
transformation
is, and
is.
it's like, oh my gosh, this super
Yeah.
soldier serum just cured him of everything, and it has to work, and it becomes like this big thing that's kind of, I don't know, that everybody wants to take after. So we
Mhm.
still see in Marvel things like what's it called, the Falcon and Winter Soldier, where they're
Yeah.
still
like they're
fighting
still making
to
these
make the
eugenesis
serum.
serums.
to make
Oh
people
my
stronger.
God.
Like, it's not, it didn't stop in the 40s, you know, in the like first Avenger, and we see it constantly kind of like used throughout. Like it was used on like Bucky,
Mhm.
and it's even, I think in comics, like supposed to be used on like Natasha as well.
Mhm.
So it's just like this thing that keeps going on and on, but like this idea with Steve of
Yeah,
like deserving
The
it.
idea is still always that he's the only one who is successful. And he's
Successful,
also
yes,
like
exactly.
the good one. Like he's the only one that deserved it, because all the others are seen sort of like mistakes. Like
Right.
these people are going to be so dangerous. You don't know what they'll do if they're superpowers.
Like corrupted
whatever.
minds, especially.
Yeah, and I think watching the first Avenger, they really drive home how good Steve is and how this
Mhm.
sort of long list of disabilities is like holding him back. It's like, well, he's such a good man. He like fights bullies. He was like, keep your voice down at the movie theater.
Right.
And he stands up for others and all of these things. But unfortunately, he has all of these disabilities and
Right.
chronic illnesses. And luckily, science can give him the sort of like perfect body to match his perfect character or his
Right.
perfect mind and personality, you know?
And it's interesting that we see that, you know, we have to, you know, bring this up, but it's interesting that we see that in like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white man who gets to have all these like great things to basically be seen as the perfect man.
Mm-hmm.
And not just in universe, but also like, you know, here, like he's in like real life is like, oh my gosh, Captain America is the perfect guy. And then you even think about like the actors that play him, and I know like Chris Evans,
We love you, Chris.
yeah, we love you, Chris. Has kind of talked about the pressure of playing a character like that and being seen as like this perfect person who really,
like you
in a lot
are
of-
America, which
Right.
means white, blonde,
Mhm.
male, able-bodied.
Right. So it's just like these very interesting kind of things all kind of like coming together for that.
Yeah. Also visually in film, I think it's interesting that there are no downsides to his being superpowered. Like he
Yeah.
just seems like a super normal person. Like other superheroes, their superpowers sort of make them maybe abnormal. Like maybe it's not socially acceptable for you to climb on walls or like
Right.
emit slime or something. But Captain America is literally everything that is desirable and normal,
Mhm.
but like super,
Right.
like accentuated.
He has the strength, he has the speed and vulnerability, like he can, the stamina, like
Mm-hmm.
everything. Yeah, it's so we do have this transformation scene that we wanted to kind of include in here.
That can show you a lot of what we were just talking about.
Right. And kind of like how you can see also in the clip how people are kind of just like drawn to him in his like new physical form. Obviously, like I would also be doing the same thing.
You would be Peggy Carter.
I would be Peggy Carter touching his chest. But okay, so we're gonna play the clip.
Mr. Stark?
Son of a bitch did it.
We did it. Yeah. I think we did it. You actually did it.
How'd you feel?
Tyler.
As you can hear in those clips, especially that second one, like the epic music, all of this is really celebrated as like a societal achievement for the nation. Just turning this one disabled man into the perfect, not just a perfect person, but a perfect soldier.
Right. And I think right before we kind of wrap this episode up, and get into kind of our final points, I do want to mention really quick, fan works in this, and it kind of touches on what we were talking about of how his disabilities kind of lessen in each like medium or whatever that we like see him in. And so in comics, so much, like so many disabilities. In the movie, it's lessened a little bit, but it's still a pretty long list. And then in fan works, it's literally boiled down to, hey, Steve has severe asthma, and
he's like frail.
And he's very frail. And we were talking. That's just so interesting to me, and I something like clicked in my mind, even though I knew this already, but just connecting it to a kind of disability justice type of thing. They did it it was to make him more palatable,
exactly,
and easy to work with, in fanworks, because they oftentimes use pre-Serum Steve as kind of like a foil to Bucky, who is usually bigger. Depending on what you're getting, he's either more brooding or more like suave, depending on which Bucky you're getting, after accident or pre-accident.
Oh no.
But they use him to kind of be, quote unquote, the bottom. And they're like, hey, we're using his disability, quote unquote, as like a reason for him to be in a power kind of stance.
Yeah.
Weaker and lesser than Bucky. And it's more attractive. And we even like, there's so many fics with like the tag pre-Serum Steve. People love it. People love it.
Yeah, maybe people only love it because pre-Serum Steve to them just has asthma and is really skinny and kind of fragile, because honestly, all that other stuff like on his list of disabilities, like it's just like not sexy to these people, so they don't want to write about it, and it kind of ruins the sort of like dynamic that they're going for.
Right, exactly. And it's just like, yeah, but then they also, it's funny because they also, when they do have post Serum Steve in like these fan works, he's still very much keeping that whole like, but I used to be so small, and I can't believe that like I can breathe fine now, and like all of this stuff. And it's just like he's basically keeping the same personality, or like the way he perceived the world as kind of pre-Serum Steve, like in it. And not just like, hey, I'm like a good man or whatever, but like very much like insecure about his like body and stuff like that. So it's like, it's interesting like what they pick and choose, what kind of like disabilities they would like to write about.
Like what they consider, what kinds of disabilities they will consider still attractive.
Right.
Yeah.
Just wanted to like mention that. I don't know. Like, I think it's his like, yeah, like his like smaller body and like the disabilities that they do end up kind of including in those fan works are very like much fetishized, and they're like, this is what we can write about, and this is what still kind of makes him like sexy and workable for like these works. But yeah,
Also, something you just said made me think of something for the first time, which is that Steve is someone who, like you said, like remembers what it was like
Mm-hmm.
to be disabled, to be small, to be frail, to kind of be like unwanted
Mm-hmm.
by society. And it does kind of like, I think that's actually something interesting that the movie and all these Captain America narratives do. Like, how do these like super abled people, like, what if these super abled people knew what it was like
Right.
to be not just normal, but to be disabled?
Right. And it's also like interesting to think about like how it's like he will always remember this, even though for a majority of his life he's, I think, like
In the
over
ice.
100. He's been post serum Steve. You know,
But he's like in the ice for the majority.
right?
Of
He's
time.
in the ice, but like he
Unconscious.
still has like
Yeah,
this
yeah.
perfect body, and yeah, I don't know, pretty interesting. But
Yeah, we just want to wrap up by pointing again to the sort of division between Steve's mind or his
Mhm.
character, his soul, and his weak and then super perfect body,
Mhm.
and how he was kind of rewarded for being good. Like going back to the
Yeah.
clip that we started this episode with, he gets a good body because he's a good man.
Mhm.
But this kind of implies that getting that good body or having all of these changes that the serum does to his body doesn't affect who he is at the core.
Mhm.
And we think that this sort of like central idea that who you are has nothing to do with your body's disability or ability is actually the idea that's at the core of his story, and is also an interestingly very ableist idea.
Mhm. Yeah, it's it ties into once again it ties into this idea of being fixed and being cured, and the kind of, I guess, how this like idea of perfect body is prioritized so much. It's like on like this is what we should be like living up to, and it's basically a treat. If you're a good person, you get to have like this perfect body, and it's kind of like tied into these like notions of disability being like once again a punishment for sin or bad behavior or
Mhm.
anything like that. But it's like, no, he kind of just was unlucky until he wasn't, because he was a good person, so he deserves it, you know. And it's
Yeah.
just this like weird, it's very like ableist in nature.
Yeah, and heavy on the medical model. Like, I think if the film kind of subscribes to any particular model about disability, it would be the medical model.
Mm-hmm.
In that view, it would be a very kind of like inspirational story about a disabled man who, despite his disabilities, like persevered
Mm-hmm.
and was so good and had a great personality and had solid values. And then due to like the miracle of science, they found a way to cure that disability.
Right. And yeah, it's very interesting to think about Steve as the kind of weak body and like perfect mind essentially, and kind of contrast
Mhm.
that with a character like Wanda, who's often seen as having, being able-bodied, being very powerful, but having a very weak or
Very
kind of
unstable mind.
unstable mind. So we will talk more about that in the next episode, but thanks for listening, and stay tuned for what we have up next.